Welcome to the Generational Exchange. Today, our topic is how we can use the idea of sharing stories to build a stronger business culture. To help us with this, we have a very special guest joining us today, Mr. James Warren, the founder of Share More Stories. So, with that, let's start the exchange. Have you ever wondered what happens when you bring together four seasoned professionals, each with their own unique generational lens on the business world? Well, you've come to the right place. Join our hosts in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s as we tackle the big questions, share decades of combined experience, and unravel the threads of today's professional challenges. Plus, in select episodes like today, we will be joined by insightful guest panelists to offer even deeper dives into specific topics. Expect clever takes, engaging debates, a healthy dose of humor, and a few stories proving wisdom is ageless. So let's jump in. Before we get to our guest, I want to welcome back our panel. As always, representing the delightful 30s is Mr. Rhett Suchu. Good evening, Rhett.
Hello, sir.
And the dynamic 40s, as our script says, Mr. Jeremy Davidson. Hello, sir.
Hey, I'm digging that intro. You got through that in one shot. That was slick.
Right? I'm getting better. I'm practicing.
Good
And
to be
hanging
here.
on by a thread is our good friend and mentor who represents the 60s, Mr. Mark Russell. Hello, Mark.
Good evening. Great to be here.
Yes, sir. And as always, I am representing the 50s, not the 1950s, but the generation 50s. So, anyway, welcome to the Generational Exchange. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest, and then we'll introduce him directly. James Warren is the founder and CEO of Share More Stories, a human experience research company established in 2014 in Richmond, Virginia. SMS focuses on using storytelling and AI-driven analytics to uncover emotional insights and improve human experiences for brands and organizations. The company developed the Seek platform in 2018, which enables real-time story sharing and analysis to enhance customer, employee, and community engagement across sectors like tourism, financial services, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. James is also the vice president of brand strategy at JMI, a marketing firm specializing in community engagement. With over 25 years of experience in marketing, storytelling, and organizational development, he has led projects like the Future of Travel, which provided insights into multicultural travel experiences. James studied at Princeton University in economics and literature and graduated from Columbia University with creative writing. Warren, Mr. Warren is a passionate advocate for storytelling as a tool for connection and understanding. And if that wasn't enough, he has spoken at events like the Lean Startup Conference and the Triangle 2 Members Innovation Summit, emphasizing the roles of stories in leadership and innovation. James's personal storytelling reflects themes of family, community, and resilience, often drawing from his experience as a father and an entrepreneur. Despite early challenges, including a failed crowdfunding campaign, SMS has grown into a nationally recognized platform under his leadership. James, that was an incredible background, but thank you for joining us and welcome to the Generational Exchange. I think I got
Thanks
through
for
that
having me.
okay.
Glad to be here. Absolutely. Thank you.
Is there anything that we didn't touch on before we jump in? I know I did a lot of word salad there introducing you, but is there anything else you want to tell the audience before we dive into kind of our questions?
Well, it's funny you bring up word salad because for many years I kept my LinkedIn handle as I love word salad, and I thought it was hilarious and I thought it was memorable. But eventually I decided to grow up a little bit and adjust it. But you can still find me because LinkedIn is great that way. You can always go to an old handle, it will still bring you to the person's page. So I love word salad is taken. You know, for
Oh,
Sorry, Rhett.
darn. All right. Well, my people will be in touch, James. Don't worry.
like the old days of buying domains.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
Right.
not to
uh,
digress too far, but why I love word salad.
well, I'm trying to be a little witty with it, and I do love words. I love words as a way of, communicating. I love to write.
Hmm.
And my point was, I think we use word salad in kind of a little bit of a, poke the bear kind of way. But when you really think about it, I really believe salads. I don't eat a lot of salads, to be clear. But when I do, I like to put a lot in it. I like to mix it up, get lots of flavors, textures. And
Hmm.
if you read anything that I write, it's kind of like that. So that's why I said I like word salad. I love word salad.
I think that's
That's great.
fantastic. That's fantastic. And if anybody has been to your website, You've got just these interesting diametric pictures, and it's a fantastic website, and we'll get into all that, I promise. But just for everybody here, we're going to be kind of asking James questions, and as usual, I'm sure we're going to be sharing anecdotes and stories. But I think if that's okay, we're going to go ahead and dive in. And Mark, I think you've got the first question for James today.
Yeah, so James, obviously, share more stories will help companies capture those employee narratives, right? From
Yep.
your perspective, how does the act of sharing those personal and professional stories specifically help bridge those communication gaps and will foster that understanding between the different generations, especially today within our multi-generational workforce?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mark. I think, when we talk about sharing personal stories, personal narratives, what we're really asking people to do, inviting them to do, is think about an experience they've had with the company or around a specific topic. It could be think about your most challenging assignment you've ever had. What did it feel like to get through that? Or think about the thing you feel you failed at the most. Whatever we want to kind of push on and learn about. And then you ask a wide, range or representative group of the employees. You invite all of them if you can to share their stories about that. And what starts to happen almost immediately is you definitely find what makes people sort of unique in that space, which I think is important, but you also find these hidden commonalities, these threads of shared values or shared needs or shared emotions in their experiences. And that becomes almost like a little bit of a key to a lock. Like, well, wait a minute, we think about and talk about so much of our the things that make us distinct and unique in the workplace and elsewhere. We think about demographics, behavioral demographics. We think about employee demographics. They work in this department. They've only been with the company this many years. They were a intern conversion. They were an experienced hire. And we think about all these things in ways that are meant to theoretically help us describe and understand people, but sometimes those things mask what they actually have in common. And we think that everybody who works in manufacturing cares about this, and everybody who works in brand cares about that. You find out in this process when you explore stories around shared experiences, or at least experiences that they would have in common,
Mhm.
you find out a lot more about those employees. And what you might find is the folks in manufacturing, in fact, don't all think alike. Maybe there's three or four different, emotional styles in manufacturing,
Mhm.
but two of those emotional styles are very much in common with folks in sales and folks in legal. And so it's a way to kind of take what we believe or preconceive or even stereotype about people at work and find ways to say, well, what actually is it that makes them tick and what do they have in common? And that part about what they have in common is almost always a surprise because it's emotionally driven. It's not demographics, it's not behaviors.
Okay. And I've got a couple of follow-ups, but one of the follow-ups is because we want to share our story, how can we become better listeners
Mm,
first?
yeah.
Because obviously we want to jump in with our experience, but we probably are missing a lot of what other people are sharing. So how do you help guide people to be those better listeners first?
I think that's a great point. And I think especially if you're the team lead or if you're the company leader, um, whatever that role is where it's your job to understand, to listen, you got to put yourself in that mindset and in that place. You got to practice it. You got to practice listening. You got to practice creating space for other people's stories. And it's not always linear because it depends on the context of that team and that culture. If that team needs your example of vulnerability and openness, then you've got to share first. If that team is just dying to tell you what's been going on in their lives because they're used to a leader who does all the talking, then you've got to be able to say, you know what? We're not going to start with me. I want to hear what's going on in your lives and experiences. And they may struggle to say, you really want to know what, not just what I think, but what's happening with me?
Mhm.
Yes, I want to know. So then you got to find one or two kind of culture carriers who are maybe a little bit more on the open side, who are willing to set that example among their peers and encourage them to share first so that you really can move it away from maybe the view that it's hierarchical or it's always the boss sets the tone, but really let's look beyond that. Let's look across the team, across the culture to find other folks who can demonstrate it. So it really just depends a little bit on knowing where specifically your team or your company is at? Do they need to see you be a little bit more vulnerable and open, or do you need to make space for them to start talking? And sometimes it's both, even in the same room. So you might start, and then you might close, shut up real quick and let other folks start coming in with their stories.
Yeah, excellent. And one last follow up is, as the quote spoiler alert, right? Chris already said I was in the '60s category. Um, I always love sharing stories, but I need to remain relevant with those younger team members. So, for an example, and since I have coached, all three of my esteemed colleagues here. Uh, I love the examples, the business and the personal, relevant life lessons from the movie Apollo 13. Now, I was 11 in 1969, and then that movie wasn't made until 1995. At what point does that no longer become relevant for someone 40 or younger? Or how can I really kind of blend that? Because it is personal to me, and I do want to show those great examples.
Yeah. That's a great question too. I think about a few things, like one of my all-time favorite movies, and I can quote scenes in it. So Remember the Titans, right? Like I love that movie.
Oh yeah.
Denzel
And
Washington.
that movie feels to me like it came out 5 years ago because Denzel is like a timeless actor. There's some guys in that cast that you've seen in other shows and movies since, and some of them don't look like they've aged all that much. So like I see that movie and I'm like, man, this is it. And I realized that my younger son, well, my second oldest son, he was, I don't know if he was even born when it came out, but he was either in his mom's womb or he was an infant, a newborn. My oldest son was whatever, 3 years old or so when that movie came out. So even though I associate them of having been around me when I watched it, they don't remember it. In fact, my younger kids know more about it than my older kids because they've had to endure me watching it, pausing and saying, "Did you see that?" And they're like, "Yes. Can you please press play?" None of us enjoy watching movies with each other, by the way, because we all can't stand each other's movie watching styles. Um, and so, anyway, back to the point. I think that what we're really talking about is how and when are stories timeless versus when do they feel like the news, and I feel like when stories are timeless, it's they're dealing with human condition. So even if I'm telling an old story, I try to relate it to the human condition of the folks in the room. And I might start that by asking you a question like, have you ever had a time when, or can you think of a time when? Because that's actually the prompt. And the prompt is what their brain starts to go to. So I might be thinking about a time that happened to me 40 years ago. They may be thinking of something that happened to them 4 weeks ago. But if we think about a time when, then we are connecting immediately because we're not focused on what was happening when this happened as the start of your story. We're focused on, do you have an experience like this that sticks in your memory that you feel is relevant to this question? And that brings people to a central place instead of us trying to sort of force things together. It's just the center place becomes that prompt, that story, that invitation, and then folks just start chiming in because they've got things that they can recall.
James is great. The Mark, I'm glad you asked him that. I was going to chime in and say, if Rhett says, "Okay, boomer," you went down the wrong path, right? Like that's.
Brett would never say that to me.
I would. I value
And
my
I
past job too much.
That's right. And I know we've got lots of questions for you already, but James, just out of curiosity, I, I mean, this seems so common sense in a way, but clearly you found a space and a business in this. Can I just ask how you kind of found your way here to, like, this clearly needs to be taught, right? Everything, a lot of times when we talk to people, things that we're learning are common sense and yet they don't seem to translate. How did you kind of get to this?
Yeah, I mean, it happened all at once and over 40 plus years, right? Most things that we find ourselves deeply passionate about took a while for us to get there, whatever that is. And for me, my whole life, since I was old enough to have a version of a plan, I wanted to be an entrepreneur and I wanted to be a writer. And I knew that my whole life to the point where sometimes it caused me to deviate from the path. I'll make one small correction to the intro. Fun fact, I never graduated college because I was so convinced that I didn't need my degree when I got to college, that I was destined to be an entrepreneur and a writer and it would not matter. And so I've had to learn how to even overcome that challenge because some places in business, we have beliefs about what that represents. And I've learned that my ability to connect with people, my ability to share a story, to create a connection, my ability to listen well became sort of tools for me to overcome some of those things, even in work. I started in corporate America as an intern and said, "Hey, I'm not your normal intern." And they said, "That's okay. We want to know what you know and we want you to grow your career here." And so I had opportunities that came along the way, but I started feeling really very much like I want to write and I want to write stories. And I also want to work with people who really want to focus on storytelling. And so that's when the company got started in 2014. And my first vision was a new social media platform because in 2014 I already thought Facebook was ruining us. And so I said, how could we build a better social media platform? And, the idea was creating a space where people could share stories about themselves. Because the thing I learned early in a lot of the digital and tech landscape is, most of these platforms, they used to be actually social networking and now they're truly social media. They're one to many.
Mm,
Back then it was even maybe 10%
Mhm.
of folks created content and 90 consumed, and now it's probably down to maybe 1 to 3%. And so I knew we needed a place and space where more people could feel heard, express themselves, and didn't have to deal with how big is your audience and how many likes do you have, but can you find a place where you can express yourself? And so that was kind of the starting point. But then, my mentors and advisors who I had done great things in my corporate career, built new businesses, built brands, and I'd put a lot of that insight on pause because starting your own business from scratch is not the same as building businesses, bankrolled by a Fortune 500 company.
right.
And so my mentors were like, "Hey, this is a great idea, but it's not a business." And I was like, "But it'll be one." And they were like, "But when?" Because you have a family and you have needs. And so I'm thankful that I had a lot of great mentors who kept pushing me towards find a problem that you can solve. We hear this a lot. Don't be a solution in search of a problem. And I understand that. I also think sometimes if you have a passion, you are reacting to a macro problem. And what you need to do is figure out how to take that macro problem and make it a little bit more solvable and actionable. And then you have a business. And that's the journey we were on. It took a while, but we got there.
Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Sorry. And I know, guys, I jumped in as I always do. So,
No, it was kind of an interesting segue though, because hearing James kind of go back and revisit his intro on there, the I would you get phenomenal college experience, graduate, you don't graduate. I wouldn't tend to look at something like that as a limitation. The but I suppose in the context of Fortune 500 funding and startups, and that tends to be something folks probably value. Oh, you went to Harvard Business School, heck yeah. Well, here's your check. The Was it more of a mindset thing with you? Is it kind of you got to overcome that imposter syndrome, or was it something you actually felt from others?
Um, Really almost never felt it from others, and I did have the chance to go to great schools and build amazing networks and teammates from my rowing days and my roommates and folks I hung out with. Like I've stayed in touch with them over the years, and some of us have stayed very close. So it was never that, and it wasn't even my family. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I grew up in a home and in a family where we would go through times where we had everything, and then we'd go through times where we had nothing. So I kind of developed this understanding of like how to deal with people wherever they're at in life, including myself. Like sometimes things are going great and sometimes they're not. I think that specific to education, the thing I learned is if you find people who value your work, that's the most important thing. And I've extended that to everybody I've ever met in my life at work, anywhere else in community, so forth. But it was mainly the pressure I felt was largely self induced. I would say it was definitely a version of imposter syndrome before I knew what imposter syndrome really was. I was just like, I think I'm supposed to be doing something different, and I feel the pressure to be that, and I don't know why, you know.
Sure.
For sure.
Um, but yeah, I think that's where
You
it
think
came from largely.
you think that can become a part of that share more stories? Because that's something a lot of folks deal with, whether they're jumping in early in their career or they just took that big promotion and they're stepping into a new role, or can
Yeah.
can sharing at that level of vulnerability, can that be helpful for folks? Have you seen any of that?
It really can be, and you're reminding me of one of our, we started the Seek platform back in 2018, and then we went through the pandemic, and that changed our business model because at the time we were doing everything in sort of workshops and doing all the analytics offline, right?
Mm,
And COVID happens, and we had to move workshops to Zoom, and then we had to really, in
mhm,
response to our customers, build out a platform, make it easier. They would say, "This is great, this is amazing, and it's also like really high touch, and we can't scale it. What if we want to talk to, instead of 20 employees at a time, 200 or 1,000? How do we get there?" And so, we started developing a platform that was based on what we had done in our early Seek sessions. And the biggest thing I was afraid of was whether or not people would have that same like emotional connection that they would have in the live sessions. I was wondering, like, will they really get into this, or will they just sort of, say, "Hey, this was great," and kind of treat it a little less emotionally. Well, our first project after we launched the online platform was with a management consulting firm, and they had a learning and development head who said everybody in our company's got imposter syndrome. And I was like, that's a very wild statement. How can everybody have imposter syndrome, and how would you
Right.
know that? And why
right.
would you think that, and then why would you say that? Like, it just felt so intense. And I immediately disagreed personally, because I was like, maybe that's a different kind of imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome I'm thinking of, because I was looking at it through my lens, Jeremy, is, like, you've had a hard time, maybe you've had to really, really struggle, and maybe you wonder if you've done everything you need to do, or know everything you need to know, or maybe you wonder if you've made it. And so I was very much looking at it through my lens, right, of what imposter syndrome might be, or what I read about or saw about in others. Well, I was blown away when we did this project because, granted, they wanted us to engage their new hires, people who had been with the firm for less than 2 years. They had a summer cohort program. They'd bring you in right after graduation. You'd go into an immersive learning program for, you know, first 6 months. Then you're really on a client team, and then you're kind of going through the next 2 years. And they said, we hire the best and the brightest. We depend on them coming in and hitting the ground running. Like, these are all alpha types in their schools. They've done all the things that check the boxes, and they're not connecting. They're not plugging in. They're not
Mhm,
starting fast. And they were like, as we've heard anecdotally from a couple of them, they were saying things that sound like imposter syndrome. So they said, is that something we could figure out through the stories? And so we decided to try it. This was the first project of the new platform too. So it's kind of like, looking back, it was a bit of a risk to take because we didn't know if this was even the right kind of question to ask. But we
Sure.
did. We asked people, we said, just so everybody has the same definition, this is imposter syndrome, where, despite all evidence to the contrary, you feel underprepared, or ill-equipped to do the job or task at hand. And that was their story, right? Like, they had the degrees, they had the experiences, they had the extracurriculars, they had been hired in a very competitive process, and they felt like they didn't, know how to or deserve those jobs. So what we found was fascinating. Not only did everybody in fact feel what he said they felt, we also engaged some of the older members of their firm, and we learned that they had all felt the same way, but earlier in their careers.
mm,
Sure.
And what they told us was, here's what I did about it, in their own stories. So the big light bulb was, you actually already have the answers to this problem in your organization. You have these individuals who actually navigated imposter syndrome before they knew what to call it, and you just have to put them in a conversation together. You have to shift the focus of your mentoring. You have to shift the focus of your onboarding experience to put these experienced people together with these new people and talk about that piece. That's what we talk about when we talk about, like, emotional stewardship as leaders. Sometimes it's more than just, are we training them on the right tasks, tools, and systems, the right policies and programs? are we also training them on or making space for them to explore how all this new stuff feels and where it goes from here?
That's great. I love that. And it's a multi-generational approach.
Right.
Yes, definitely was. Definitely.
And I
Well,
saw
it
Mark
shows it's
peek up
also
there
not
too.
generationally focused either. I'm sorry, Jerry, I didn't mean to step on you, but it's not a Gen Z problem or a millennial problem. These things have
Right.
always existed. We have better
Yeah,
labels for it, and we may actually be talking about it more. I think we all probably felt it, but we didn't have, like you said, we didn't have a label for it, and maybe we didn't even know how to articulate it or anybody to tell.
that's right. Definitely.
Yeah, James,
Hilarious.
I'm curious there, like, because I tend to be a bit of a numbers guy, probably too much sometimes, right? But when you're looking at the impact of um and measurable kind of results from this type of program, what have you seen from things like employee retention or onboarding effectiveness? The things that you're talking about, are there numbers to it at all? Is it a I mean, obviously there's impact, but how do you kind of measure that? Or I guess talk to it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there is a way to measure it. It starts depending a little bit on the organization and their systems.
Mhm.
Sometimes the organization is coming to us saying, we don't we don't know this part of our culture. So the first step is to like baseline it,
Right.
and to create an emotional map of the culture. And we literally do that when we analyze the stories. We score them for 55 different emotions and attitudes, values, needs. So you get a really granular visual picture of what kind of experiences are people having with you and how do they feel about those experiences. And maybe that's your baseline. If you already know you have a problem in the organization, let's say you've done your employee engagement surveys or you've
Mhm.
done your NPS, or you've done your CSATs, and you realize, hey, here we have a gap, then our process is really good at helping you understand why you have that gap.
Okay.
And so part of the measurement of success in the immediate is, do we see a change occur when we put in place actions, and solutions based on what we learn? Now that's a big if, because there's, corporate America is full of um, offices with stacks of research reports.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
doing the research alone doesn't really mean anything. It's, can you frame it in a way that inspires leaders to take action? And so sometimes what we say, that's why we talk about like kind of moving upstream. You might think you have a customer problem, but you really have an employee experience problem. You might think you have an employee experience problem, you really have a leadership problem.
Sure.
And so we try to get them to start to realize, what is it about my leadership that needs to shift in order for this employee experience to improve? And then you can measure that improvement either through your existing metrics, like you said, retention,
Mhm.
engagement levels, but you can also track the change in the emotions of the experience over time and
Yeah.
see if people are having the experiences that you saw that were good and you want
Right.
more of those. Are we seeing more of those? So it really depends on what's their sort of existing measurement approach. Then we try to back into that with what we can learn from the emotional side of it.
Yeah. It would be really interesting, James, to, I guess, like, see that, especially with, because we always talk about companies that need the service, right? But I try to ask about how do you get ahead of when you need the need. And so it would
Yes.
be interesting to see a company measure and look at their emotional environment, where it's at, and then either track it and see if there's any significant issues that go on with the company, or talk about, hey, we want it to stay within this range, and this is part of what we look for in our diverse hiring, is the experiences and the emotional stories that people are coming in with, and just see if, like, hey, X company, you know, grew by 300% and they didn't have any major failures. Is part of that
Yeah.
because of, like, the stories, and that everyone was able to relate to each other and apply it? That emotional environment test or measure that you're talking about would be super
Yeah.
interesting to see.
Yeah. Totally.
Well, and James, you touched on something, if I may, too, just so I don't lose the thread. You are giving action to all of those things that we all tend to do: NPS scores, customer CSAT. It's kind of like we've talked about this on previous shows. So what? You've got a 7. so what? This is like the now what? This
Exactly.
is something you do with it and you get to
Yeah.
action on it. Like that just connected all the dots for me. Because a lot of
Yes.
times it's then we're like, okay, great, we've got unhappy employees and we're all trying to figure out what do we do with it. So I love that this gives you an action direction to do something, if I'm interpreting that correctly.
No, you're absolutely right, and you hit the nail on the head. It's like, okay, you got a 7. You're exactly right. It's going from, so what to now what, and I think that the way you get there is through the stories. The people will tell us, like the folks who are saying, "I'm loving my experience." Great, you just gave us the high watermark. That's what we are striving for, and we have an emotional picture of those great experiences. The
Mm.
people who aren't loving those experiences, they're telling us why. They're telling us these are the things that are happening in my experience that make me not love working here, that make my Sunday nights the worst day of the worst time of the week, and
Mm.
everything in between, right? And so rather than us guessing why is their score what it is, the stories tell us exactly what's happening. And it's just a great way to kind of correlate. It doesn't mean those other data aren't useful. It's just that those data tell you who, what, when, and where, but they don't tell you why, and they don't tell you all the how. So you need something else to kind of fill that in to say, well, why is that happening, and how is it happening, and how do we fix it? And that's where I think that level of going deeper into people's experiences and their emotions can help us do it. Because again, for so many of our decisions, there's a lot of decisions we make at work, as consumers, in our home lives, that we're kind of making them on autopilot. There's like subconscious stuff, then there's like rational decisions, then there's emotional decisions. um, the things that really tend to leave this long-term mark are those decisions that we've made consciously, that have an emotional weight to them. Those are the things that we find ourselves thinking about, either reliving with joy or regretting. And
Mm.
sometimes we're feeling those at the hands of our managers and supervisors. And sometimes they need to spend a little bit more time reflecting on whether they should regret some of those decisions, so we don't have to all bear the burden of them. But I think that's what's happening sometimes in organizations, and there's a way through it. If we listen to the voices and stories of our teams a little bit differently than we do today, we can find out a lot about their why, and we can figure out if we can connect their why to the company's why in a more, in a deeper way, in a more lasting and mutually beneficial way.
Uh, Do you feel like the companies that are successful that take advantage of something like this, there's almost I don't want to overstate the word, but a sense of bravery. Like you've got to be a little brave as a leader to take that feedback, to hear the stories, and be bi-directionally honest and transparent. I feel like the places where I've worked where that is successful, there's a willingness, there's a bravery in a sense to not just say this is how it should be and actually meet people where they are and listen. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's a fair statement or
Yeah.
not.
No, it's,
Take
it's
action.
fair. Sorry, what was that?
I was going to say, take action.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a leadership mindset that says, I really want to listen, learn, and act, or as
Mhm.
we say in the most literal sense, engage, analyze, and act. Because the act of asking people to share their stories is an act of engagement, and therefore it is an act of vulnerability, because it's not predictable. You don't know what you're going to get,
Mhm.
and that,
Yeah.
like, we're used to that. That's the everyday. But there are leaders who are like, well, I would like to ask these 5 questions, and we're like, I'm sure you would, but you already asked those 5 questions, and a lot. So, what are you going to really learn by asking those 5 questions again and again? I mean, incrementally, you'll see if their answer changed, 0.5%, since last year. But what you really want to know is the things you don't know.
Mhm.
You really want to know what you don't know. And I think I underestimated, because of my optimism and a little bit of naivete. I underestimated how hard that is for a lot of leaders in modern company culture to be comfortable
Oh, for sure.
asking and exploring what they don't know the answer to. I had an
Yes.
executive say this to me once on a project. I never ask a question I don't know the answer to, and my
Yep.
instinctive response is, well, how do you learn anything? Which was a
Right.
bad way to respond to to a senior executive. But my peer sitting next to me had the same look on their face, like, you what? Like, that sounds like a line from some '80s courtroom drama, like, never ask a question you don't know the answer to, and
That's right.
and but you have to, because otherwise, how do you learn anything? And so I think, again, the stories have answers to questions that we have not asked. The only way we get those answers is by asking that question.
Mm,
And it does require some bravery from leaders, but it is rewarding because I've seen some of um, the more I'm expected to have all the answers. I project presence.
mm,
I lead through earned authority. I've seen some of those leaders, if they just took a chance when they do, they find out something about themselves that shocks them. They're like, wow, I didn't expect to feel this way.
right.
I didn't expect to have this in common. I'm sitting here, I've got a C in front of my title, and I'm sitting next to this person who's probably, I don't know, a gazillion levels different than me. And I just realized we have the exact same, sort of motivation or experience or value. That's when it gets really, really rich. When again, whether it's generations or levels or departments, when people start to find that they have something in common that they didn't expect, it's a magic moment.
I think you should have looked right across the table at him and said, "You can't handle the truth."
Exactly. Thank you. Thank
Right.
you for pulling that. I was like, I know it's somewhere. It's somewhere in there. That's a good one. I like that movie
Yeah.
too.
No, but it's so true, James. I mean, you're always like in corporate America, especially, you're always trying to control the narrative, right? And
Yes.
control the controllable, right? But at times you can take that too far into you're trying to control the uncontrollable. And like
Yes.
you're not you want change, but you're practicing insanity, which is you're doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right?
Well,
So,
I like the bravery analogy because
yeah,
you've got to be willing to hear the stuff you don't want to hear. That you've got an
Prepared to,
employee that's
yeah.
bored,
yeah,
or you got to have the door open to hear somebody complain about a particularly challenging customer and understand the employee just needs to vent. Doesn't mean they're a bad employee, right? I think you've got to have an openness to be able to hear some of that stuff and in a non-judgmental way, so that your folks will tell you the truth, so that you're aware when there's discontent on the team, you're aware when there's a problem, you're aware when there's a mentoring or a learning opportunity on the team.
right.
I don't know. For me, that really kind of resonated, and for those leaders that are out there that don't have that kind of connection with their team, where maybe it's a leadership problem. There's not that safety net where they feel like the employees feel like they
Right.
can express themselves, or maybe it's in part an employee issue where they've heard over and over again, don't bring your personal stuff to work.
Right.
How do you use your share more stories to kind of fix and mend that relationship to allow for a more open sharing?
Yeah, I think, I'll say this briefly. I think one of the things that's always surprising is we go into these things thinking we're going to hear one thing. And even if we hear a lot of that, we always hear things we didn't expect. And one of those, as an example, is, the leader who's like, if I ask these questions, I'm just going to get a lot of like grief and gripe. And you don't. You really don't. Even when people are sharing a challenging experience, they're not saying, this is my opinion. They're saying, this is what happened to me. And so there's one thing we try to help the leader understand is, you know, as humans, we argue with each other's opinions all day long,
Mm,
but it's hard. It's a lot harder to argue with each other's experiences. Granted, sometimes we try, but it's hard to say that didn't happen to you if you're telling me that this is how I feel, this is what happened to me.
right.
And so we help them realize, like, this isn't an indictment on anything. This is just listening to the experiences of people around you. And if you boil it down to a very, very basic human level, if you were on a 3-person team, you would want to understand the people to your right and left. You would want them to understand you, because you would know that if we better understood each other, we could accomplish the task at hand more readily, with less friction, with a better outcome. And so I always say, whenever you're wondering, like, what's the right way to do this, bring it down to 2 or 3 people,
Mm,
because that's all we're really trying to do in large organizations, is scale that human, high quality human interaction, scale leadership with both confidence and vulnerability, and teach that to the people that we work with.
And I think
I think
sharing
that's
that's
great. I appreciate it.
yeah, and I think sharing that story too bi-directionally, right, also takes the
Yeah.
stigma away that if you do have a C in your title, you don't know everything. You are a person, right? I think
Yes.
there's this natural intimidation built in, like you must know everything if you've reached this title. And getting outside of your title so that you get seen as a person. We
Mm.
talked to somebody a few weeks ago that does personal branding, and that was something she talked about too, was getting seen as a person, not just as a title or a job. Forgive me, I have a puppy today. He's been sleeping for hours, of course. But I think it is something that being able to share your story and having a place where you can do that safely bi-directionally, I think builds that out for people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, James, it's interesting. I've seen, maybe you've seen this too, but there's always this idea, I think, when you get into leadership and being a mentor and a manager, that you want to feel or lead from the front type of thing. And leading from the front means that you don't show your stress levels or that something is impacting you or something like that. And I've had multiple experiences where employees on other teams will be like, I don't know if you've been feeling this, but I've been so stressed out the last 2 months, like, and it, like, is it impacting you? Are you type of thing? And I'm like, yeah, of course, I feel all that stress, but there's always that constant balance of being the calm in the storm type of thing, while also
Yeah.
making sure that you're keeping those pathways open, I think, for people to tell their stories and talk about the impact. You were talking about the impact of someone's story, right? There's a big difference between intention and impact, which we've talked
Mm.
about on here.
Well, Rhett, I think one of the things you're hitting on that's really key is the balance, right? Because
Uh,
both things can be true. We know that people in a group in a stressful environment tend to gravitate to somebody giving them clarity and direction.
sure.
That has been part of the human experience from the beginning of time. We do work at our best when we're interdependent, and oftentimes somebody needs to gather us together. Somebody needs to say, you know what, instead of everybody just pointing in different directions, why don't we go that way, because it's away from the cliff and it looks like there might be food, clothing, and shelter over there, right? So there's always been a need for somebody to at least offer to step into that role to help gather us and move us.
Hmm.
I think where we go wrong is when we assume that role um, gives us more power than it does.
Sure.
It's a responsibility. It's not a reward. Rarely is leadership the reward. It's really the responsibility, to say, hey, in this moment, what do they need from me that I can offer? But real good leadership says it's not only going to be me. There might be somebody in this group who knows this problem better than I do.
Right.
And so the vulnerable, authentic, and courageous leader, I think they just know how to move between those spaces of, when do I need to show vulnerability?
Mhm.
When do I need to inspire them with my courage? When do I need to actually say, you know what, we've gathered all the perspectives, let's make a decision, and I'm going to help facilitate that for us by making it,
Right.
and everything else in between. Those are different styles that all of those are tools in the toolkit. I think when a leader assumes it's all one thing all the time,
Mhm.
that's when they run the risk of alienating a large percentage of their team, because their team's going to be in different places at different times. So I think that being able to show, for me, vulnerability is absolutely a strength.
Mhm.
I intentionally lean into that extreme because I believe it's underdeveloped in lots of places in society and in leadership and in business. Sometimes I'm too vulnerable. I know that. Sometimes I'm too open,
Yeah,
but I'd rather be, for me, too open and too vulnerable than not enough, because I've seen
sure.
the negative impact on both myself and my teams when I'm keeping all that in for myself versus sharing that, trusting them, and building something together. So
Yeah,
I'll overcorrect on that end. I've got a team member who's on the other end of the spectrum. So together we balance each other out. We keep the team kind of in the middle.
very interesting. I love it.
Say, did you ask your question already?
Yep. I was watching for you.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Um,
I was going to jump in and ask hybrid in a second. No.
yeah, no, I know, right? Well, while we're talking about hybrid, right, as we're shifting work models, how do we build culture when we're remote? Like, I work for a company that is 100% distributed. We have no office. We have no easy way to bring people together. How would storytelling and sharing your stories help also kind of build that culture when we are a distributed workforce? Because that's something we're
Yeah.
continuing to try to figure out as well.
I think it's great. You know, we've all seen um, teams, obviously before the pandemic, teams that worked entirely together in an office and had a horrible culture.
Yeah.
And there were teams before the pandemic that were fully distributed and had amazing cultures. And so I think we are still, 5 years later, asking the same questions: what builds a strong culture? And I think the structure of the organization is definitely part of the answer, but I don't think it's where we start. I think we then, we think about what is the structure that best supports the kind of culture and the kind of workforce that we want.
Mm.
And so, you might be hiring people who really want a high level of freedom and they show that they can handle it. And maybe their jobs mean they need it. They need all those things. Well, then, yeah, remote makes a ton of sense. You might have a job where collaboration, especially in creative spaces, requires a lot of not just sitting in a conference room together looking at a whiteboard, because that can get really tired, but that ability to, there's only so much I can do to like do a quick Slack huddle. I use Slack. Our team is fully remote, but half of our team is in Richmond. We've got somebody in San Francisco, somebody in Atlanta, somebody in Philly. And, you know, a Slack huddle is the bane of my existence. I would rather send an email or have a phone call or meet, but a Slack huddle just drives me insane. And, you know, I have my own rules. Like when people want to do they send me a DM and then they start doing a ton of replies to the message. I'm like, I can't find the thread. They're like, well, send the replies. And I'm like, but it's just you and me having a conversation. Like, why are we doing replies to replies? Like, so everybody's got their communication hangups.
Yeah.
And I think what you have to do in a remote or hybrid environment is figure out like, well, how do people like to, most basically, how do they like to communicate? How do they like to interact to get the work done?
Mm.
And it's always got to be about the work, because culture that doesn't relate to the work is a culture waiting to fail, because it's not focused on the reason why everybody's there, which is to get this kind of work done.
Mm.
So I think, you start with the mission and vision of the organization. What are we trying to do? What kind of workforce do we need? What does that workforce really want to best communicate and collaborate?
Mm.
And then we work from there. And that may mean, 60, 40, 80, 20, 100%. But I think you're better off starting from that place than everybody's got to be in the office because I can't trust them, or work wherever you want. I don't care, because I don't think either of those is a very thoughtful answer. I think we have to ask, what do people need? And maybe stories could help us understand, well, what's happening for people when they're doing their best work.
Mm.
Now, back to that example of, you ask a question you don't know the answer to, you might not love what you hear because it might challenge your preconceived notions of how and when and where people get good work done. I know people who, I don't understand it, but they would rather do their best thinking at 11 o'clock at night. I'm like, my brain is not functioning that well at that
Mm.
point. And so if we have to collaborate, I get frustrated because I want to put a bow on it at 6, and you
Right.
don't really want to talk about it until after you've worked on it at 11 tomorrow morning. And I'm like, so we have to have conversations about how we're going to work. And if we do that, we can minimize those friction points. But people have the friction when they're sitting right next to each other in cubicles.
Yeah.
So I think figuring out the how and the why more than the what, where, when, and who is how we solve the culture gap problem.
That's a great point. Yeah, because I think we've almost romanticized the office, right? Like everything was so much better when we were in the office. We really did have a lot of the same problems. It was just more face to face rather than disaggregated. I think it's a really good point.
I've seen some folks on some teams get so much more done remote because honestly, those individuals liked the balance that their life gave them, and
Mhm.
they had the ability to say, I want to focus so I can get to these other things I like.
Right.
And they did, and their work product was like through the roof.
Mm.
I saw other people go out and they struggled, but I don't think they were struggling to be responsible. I think they were struggling to feel connected. And so I think asking and figuring out, well, then what does connection look like for you? I just think when we approach this question, the leader has to acknowledge, they have to acknowledge, I've got a bias in this, and my bias is really influencing how people talk about this. So
Mhm.
I've got to put my bias to the side if I really want to understand what this organization wants and needs. and what kind of culture could be sustained in this company.
Yeah, it's important to keep whoever you're working with, that's the decision maker, James, focused on what is your goal. I feel like every meeting you'd start with like, what is the goal that you're wanting from them? They're like, I want things to change. Then be like, then we have to do things differently. Like,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, it's just super interesting because I feel like you're constantly going to be challenging your own biases of like the way you've done it for 50 years, and you're like, okay, all right,
Yep. Those are the days when you realize, like, what did we sign up for? Because um, being instigators of change is, and that's what you all are doing in a certain respect. This idea of like really exploring not just so much generational difference, but really generational commonality,
hmm
um, is that's also provocative because it changes the way people want to think about. We want the mental shortcuts because the mental shortcuts allow us to focus on the thing we think is the harder task.
right,
But sometimes the shortcuts that we're using are outdated. And so if they're outdated shortcuts, they're not serving us well anymore. And we've got to be willing to let those go. Well, that goes back to your point about control. Like, if I can control how everybody talks about this, I have a lot of power. Now all of a sudden, our boxes and our labels and our frames, we're breaking those. Like,
yeah,
you know, nobody's going to come to me for the answers anymore. What will I do? Oh no.
sure, for sure.
So James, just trying to wrap a few things up, and I want to go back to, and I want to advocate for our listeners to really go back and watch Remember the Titans. Okay.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
So as you look at understanding the stories, creating actionable insights to then drive that success, that engagement, that strategic decision making, where's the better story in your opinion between Coach Herman Boone and Coach Bill Yost? Or is it really Gary Betir and Julius Campbell? Which
Mm.
of the two stories would you say would really help drive those understandings that created the actionable insights that then drove the success of that team?
Yeah. That's a great question. And
I'll never ask you a bad question, I promise.
it's I don't know. I got to be honest. I love the movie, every part of it. The part that I really, really loved the most was that relationship between Julius and Gary.
Mm,
I really did. I think that, you know, watching them go from sort of two leaders who really despised each other, but only despised each other based on what they'd been taught,
mm,
not what they had experienced. Um, and watching them go through real confrontation, real conflict. Like, there's no sugarcoating that.
mm,
They had to go at it physically. Even they happened to be on the same side of the line, so they didn't have as many hard hits on each other, I would imagine. But that idea of going through something, trying, and I know we use lots of sports metaphors. I try to open that up when I'm talking to folks. Like, it doesn't have to be sports; it could be something else that is hard to do, where the pressure of being great is significant. Significant.
right.
I think that's what those guys were feeling. They felt the pressure to be great. They each were used to being great before they came together. And you think about what that would have meant for that team, for that town, for maybe certain parts of Virginia history, if they hadn't figured out how to navigate that. So to me, that is just a beautiful story of what happens when you're both encouraged from the outside, but you have to make a decision on the inside. I'm going to lean in. And they challenged each other so hard. At one point, there was nothing left to do but to see what would happen
Right.
if they cooperated. And when they hit that, left side, strong side, I mean, I still get chills when they
Yeah.
said it, because the turning point in the movie, the drama of that, when the coaches were like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
something's about to happen here. Like, but I think that's true in life. When we hit that turning point and we're like, you know what? Let's try this a little bit differently. Let's trust each other. Let's see what happens when we actually act like we're on the same team.
Yeah.
Like, amazing things happen. It's never not happened. I'll put it that way. So for me, That's the part that really hits home.
No, well, and you have that specific scene where like they get done with 3-a-days, right? And Gary's like, "I'm Gary, you're Julius.
Yeah,
It's just it is
yeah,
what it is. It's fine. We can be different." He's like, "That's the problem with you. You're fine being you, and you're
yeah,
not thinking about me, you know." And he's like, "Where does how does leadership work?" He's like, "Well, I'm the captain." He's like, "Yeah, and how we're performing is based on the way you're leading, and you're not
yeah,
opening up to us, right?"
yeah.
Yeah,
Leadership reflects attitude, or attitude reflects leadership, I think he said. And
yeah,
there were so many nuggets in that movie.
yeah.
It was a good one.
Oh, so good.
Oh,
I like the concept there that the stories, the connection that they built together ended up building and creating and strengthening the entire community around that. And
Yes.
I know you do a lot with community building around the development of those stories. Uh, I've got a neat customer market in the segment I work in. I work with emergency managers and first responders and stuff.
yeah,
And one of the challenges we've been looking at is how do we build that community? If I wanted to seek out expert guidance and wisdom from Mr. Warren, how would I go about that? How do I dig further into this topic and learn what you could do for
yeah.
me or for my business? Or
Well, definitely would love to talk to anybody out there who wants to kind of put themselves on this path. I spent a lot of time on LinkedIn. That's my absolute favorite platform. So, back to the original point, it's no longer I love word salad, although if you really wanted to find me, you could. It's James Warren Seek, SEEQ. That's my profile on LinkedIn. And that's where I have a lot of conversation about these topics. Of course, you can go to our website, sharemorestories.com, and you could get in touch with us there. You can learn about that. And you could also, we very intentionally have sort of a community blog, which I do a lot of the the writing on, and then our Seek platform, which is where we do this kind of employee and customer research. Those stories are always private, always confidential, always anonymous. But we do have like a demo project there. So if people wanted to know what is this process like of reflecting on my story, and there they would go to seek.sharemorestories.com/demo. And people when they think about stories, they're like, yeah, like a couple sentences at the end of a survey, and then they realize, my gosh, like people are writing hundreds of words about their experiences, and we're only asking them to write just 150, and they'll write 750
That's
or
so
a
cool.
thousand. And I'm like, that means that's how much they've been holding in.
Yeah.
That's what they've been trying to tell you. That's 20 years worth worth of things they want you to know. And it's not like a gripe. It's, here's what I love about this company. Here's what's really hard for me. And they express themselves. They don't have to be great writers. We don't care about grammar. It's none of that stuff. It's like you said, come as you are, share your story, and help make the experience at your company or your brand better. It's a cool thing.
that's the now what so what to the stereotypical company culture amp survey,
That's
right?
it.
That's you're getting down into the meat, the rest of the story.
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
that's phenomenal. I'm gonna go check it out. I don't know about you guys. I'm hooked.
I have it up on my screen. I mean, it's been amazing. I feel like we could talk to you all day. We have eaten up your whole evening, and we are grateful for it. Just kind of, is there anything else you want to share, or anything else before we wrap up tonight?
No, this has been awesome. I really appreciate the conversation and learning more about what you all are doing. I love this concept of the 4 decades together. I think that's so true for life and work and business. And so grateful for the opportunity to share my story with you guys and be part of this amazing conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
James James Warren from sharemorestories.com. Thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Generational Exchange. We are so grateful you joined our intergenerational conversation. We hope it sparks some new ways of thinking about business. Thank you again to James Warren from sharemorestories.com. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more engaging conversations across the generations.